Welcome, everybody. My name is Stina Cowan. I am the Educational and Cultural Programs Manager here at the National Nordic Museum, and I am delighted to welcome you to yet another Meet the Author event. Today, we have Patrik Svensson with us. He is the author of the Book of Eels, and we are so happy to have you here, Patrik, and so looking forward to hearing about your fascinating book. New York Times called your book strange and nerdy and making waves, and we'll find out why today. The book is available at the National Nordic Museum bookstore, where you can buy it in person or online. This talk is, of course, moderated as usual by Dr. Elizabeth DeNoma. We're very happy to have her do these talks. And I want to mention that this will be our last talk before we take a break over the summer, and then we will be back in September with new exciting books and authors. Before we get started, I'd like to make a little plug for Give Big. If you can and have the opportunity, we do want to encourage you to please consider participating in Give Big this year between now and May 4th and 5th. Your support of Give Big helps the National Nordic Museum to create, among other things, high-quality virtual programs that brings the museum to homes throughout the Pacific Northwest and all over the United States. We regularly hear from participants and viewers all over the 50 states and beyond, and they tell us that the programs that we are producing are connecting them with their Nordic heritage and addressing relevant topics and providing an important sense of community and belonging. We can do this because of your generous support. Your gift makes a difference, so thank you. At the end of today's talk, we will leave room for questions. You can put those in the Q&A function on your screen, and we encourage you to post those questions as you think of them so that we can get to as many of those as possible at the end. As I mentioned, this is a series that is in collaboration with Dr. Elizabeth DeNoma, and we are so fortunate to not only have her moderate these events, but her great expertise in international literature, especially Scandinavian literature, has made it possible to offer the most current and exciting authors in this series. So thank you, Elizabeth. Dr. Elizabeth DeNoma is the founder and editorial director of DeNoma Literary Services. And in addition to her work as an editor and translator, she regularly hosts panels at international book fairs and book events. So we are happy to have both of you here, and I'm going to let Elizabeth take it from here, and we hope you all enjoy the presentation. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Stina. Welcome, everyone, particularly Patrik. Before we get started with the session today, the National Nordic Museum acknowledges that we are on the traditional land of the Coast Salish peoples, specifically the first peoples of Seattle, the Duwamish peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land itself and the Duwamish tribe. The acknowledgement doesn't take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities. Instead, it's a first step in honoring the occupied land that we find ourselves on. We acknowledge also the impact of colonialism on Indigenous peoples. The Nordic Museum celebrates the continuity of Indigenous communities in the Nordic countries in North America through exhibits, programs, collections, and we cultivate respectful relationships with each other through these partnerships. Thank you. Today, we are so pleased to have Swedish journalist and author Patrik Svensson with us. Patrik is a Malmo-based Swedish journalist. The Book of Eels is his debut, and the book has been sold to over 30 countries and praised by both the Swedish and international presses. In 2019, it was awarded the August Prize in nonfiction, the Book of Eels has been selected by Publishers Weekly in the US as one of the best books of 2020 and nominated for the Goodreads Choice Awards in 2020, the Carnegie Medal of Excellence in 2021. It was a New York Times notable book, one of Time Magazine's 100 must-read books of the year, in addition to one of the Washington Post's 50 notable nonfiction titles of the year, and on and on and on. Lots and lots of accolades. We won't spend the whole time just reading those, but we could. So as Stina said, as we're discussing the remarkable book, please pop your questions if you have them into the Q&A so that we can have a shot at getting through all of them this hour. So Patrik, let's get to you. I'm so thrilled to have the opportunity to talk to you today. Do we find you in Malmö?
Yes, I'm in Malmö, so it's actually evening here. It's 7 o'clock in the evening, but I'm very thankful for you having me, and it's going to be great.
Wonderful. Thank you again. So the first thing I'd like to take up with you, and unsurprisingly, is the protagonist of this book, the mysterious and elusive eel. You detail the many things we don't know about eels, the things we think we know about eels, and many incorrect things that people, even from Aristotle to Freud, have believed about eels through the centuries. Would you give us an introduction to the eel and the life cycle of the eel, and talk a little bit about the things we still don't know?
Yes, well, the first reason why have been so fascinated with the eel is that it actually is a remarkable animal. It's a very special creature, and if you just look at the life cycle of an eel, that's like a story in itself. You know, the European eel, the species, the European eel, they are all born in the Sargasso Sea. It's in the western part of the Atlantic. It's like 7,000 kilometers from Europe, and they're born as a small larva. It's called the Leptocephalus larva. It's a small, tiny, transparent larva that looks kind of like a willow leaf. And that's the first stage of the eel. And those small larvae, they drift with the ocean currents all the way across the Atlantic to Europe. It's a journey that can take up to 3 years. And when they reach Europe, they go through a metamorphosis. They change and become what we call the glass eel. That's a small snake-like creature that's also almost transparent. And these small glass eels, they wander into freshwater and go through the second metamorphosis, and they become what we call the yellow eel. And then they find a place to live, the yellow eel, in fresh water. And then they stay there, and they live a very solitary, very kind of passive life at the same spot for a very long time. They can stay there for 20 or 30 or even 50 years. When suddenly one fall, these yellow eel get this urge to return to the place they came from. And they swim out in the ocean and they transform once again, and they become what we call the silver eels. They stop eating completely, and their bodies change. And only now, at this point, do they become develop their sexual organs and become sexually mature. And this silver eel then swims back all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, 7,000 kilometers, back to the Sargasso Sea, and disappear down in the deep waters, where they meet all the other eels from all over Europe, and then they breed, and then they die. And that's the life cycle of the European eel.
Wow, yeah, that is impressive. I don't even know where to start with that. So, what are some things that we still don't know about it? So those seems like things that we know about the eel, but there's a lot that is still mysterious, right? And that no one has actually witnessed.
Yes. When studying the scientific history of the eel, you find out that there's been something they have called the eel question. That's been quite a big problem for natural science for hundreds of years. It's as if the eel has been harder to understand than other animals, and the eel question has been several questions actually. From the beginning, it was, what is the eel? Is it a fish or a snake or something else? And then the question has been a lot about reproduction. How does the eel breed? Does the eel have sexual differences? Are there males and females? How do they breed, and where do they breed? And the problem, of course, in a scientific point of view, is that, as I said, the eel doesn't develop their sexual organs until they're on the way back to the Sargasso Sea. So if you study an eel in Europe and you don't find any sexual organs, it's very hard to explain actually how they reproduce, and that's been a quite a big problem for natural science up until modern times, actually.
Right, and that must have been why Aristotle thought they just arose independently, right, out of thin air, sort of.
Exactly, and when you study this scientific history of the eel, I found out when I wrote the book that if I don't just ask the question, what do we know about the eel, but I also ask, how do we know the things we know? Then I found all these great stories. It's stories about science and how science works, but I also find all these great characters, people who have invested their time in trying to understand the eels. And that's when you find the story about Aristotle trying to explain how eels reproduce. He was studying eels. This is like 2,300 years ago. And he was trying to explain how they breed. And when he studied them, he, of course, didn't find any sexual organs. And he came to the conclusion. Aristotle, who was, of course, a very bright person and extremely educated for his time, when it came to the eel, he came to the conclusion that they don't breed at all. He said they are born out of mud, he said. Life that comes from nothing, you know. That was something that people actually believed for a very, 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 very long time, because they couldn't explain the reproduction of the eels. And that has also been that's also why in a lot of places in the world, there's a lot of really fantastic theories about how the eel actually is born. In Egypt, they thought that the eels are born out of the sand in the river Nile when the sun is shining on it. In parts of Italy, they believe that the eel is born out of a special form of beetle. In England, they actually thought that the eel is born when hair is dropped from a horse and falls down to a river. It just transforms into a small eel. There's a lot of great stories and a lot of myths around this, and that's because the natural science has found it so difficult to actually explain this in a scientific way.
And you detail so many of the people who have researched in this book. And for those of you who haven't yet read the book, you have a real treat in store for you. And they do have it at the National Nordic Museum, so pick it up there. I don't want to give away all of the anecdotes that are in there, but in addition to Aristotle, you cite pretty heavily from Rachel Carson, and that's would you talk just a little bit about her approach to eel research and her influence on you?
Yeah, Rachel Carson was, of course, a bright scientist and also an amazing writer who I love dearly and are so inspired by. And she was, of course, very interested in eels. She had a laboratory with a tank full of eels. She was studying how they adapted to salt water. And she also wrote about, the mystery of the eel. As a scientist, you would think maybe that she was frustrated by all the things we don't know about the eels, but she was actually enthralled by it, and that's something I'm also inspired by, that you can have this scientific approach to the world and to nature, but still appreciate the mystery, all the things that we actually still don't know, and that you actually can, I believe that you can, a world where everything is illuminated and where everything is known and all the questions are answered. That's, even for a scientific-minded person, that's a kind of boring world, actually.
Agree. Thank you for that. So in the book, you weave the history of humanities research into the eels alongside your family history, primarily your experiences with your father, which is probably, it seems that that's how you were introduced to eels, right? And it makes this a really personal natural history. It's so moving and an intimate approach. What made you approach the material from that angle? How did you want to approach the material from that angle?
Well, yes, I wanted to write like a popular science book about eels, but I also thought that just to get closer to the subject in a way, I wanted to write something about my own experience from eels. And I actually fished for eels with my father during my whole childhood. Late summer nights down by the stream, and it was always just me and him. And it was the thing we had in common, actually. It was our special thing that we did together. And I think it became very important for me and also for him, I think. And I have extremely very strong and like vivid memories from that place down by the stream and from those nights together with my father. And that was also the place where my father told me about all these mysteries surrounding the eel. And he told me about the Sargasso Sea, which to me seemed like a fairy tale place, you know. Even the name Sargasso Sea, it was like a mystery surrounding it. And so it was like a lifelong fascination that started right there with my father as a child. And then when later in life, I learned that there actually is a term called the eel question that's been part of the scientific history for ages. It was as if my own story in a way and my own origin like connected to something much larger. And that was also when the two separate stories in the book, the scientific history of the eel and my own story about my father and myself, they started to connect and intertwine in a way. And they started to reflect each other in some way. And I understood at that point that both these stories had to be part of the book and of the bigger story.
Well, it works so well. It's just so beautiful and compelling. That seems like a great place to ask you to read the first passage that you're going to share with us, which details just when it's such night when you're down at the river with your father.
Yes, I'm happy to. So this is from the beginning of the book, with it's about one of those nights down by the stream. I can't recall us ever talking about anything other than eels and how to best catch them down there by the stream. I can't remember us speaking at all. Maybe because we never did, because we were in a place where the need for talking was limited, a place whose nature was best enjoyed in silence. The reflected moonlight, the hissing grass, the shadows of the trees, the monotonous rushing of the stream, and the bats like hovering asterisks above it all. You had to be quiet to make yourself part of the whole. It could, of course, also be because I remember everything wrong, because memory is an unreliable thing that picks and chooses what to keep. When we look for a scene from the past, it is by no means certain that we end up recalling the most important or the most relevant. Rather, we remember what fits into the preconceived image that we have. Our memory paints a tableau in which the various details inevitably complement each other. Memory doesn't allow colors that clash with the background. So let's just say that we were silent. In any case, I don't know what we might have talked about if we did. We lived just a mile or two from the stream. When we got home late at night, we would pull off our wellies and waders on the front steps, and I would go straight to bed. I'd fall asleep quickly. And just after 5 in the morning, Dad would wake me up again. He didn't need to say much. I got out of my bed straight away, and we were in the car a few minutes later. Down by the stream, the sun was rising. Dawn colored the lower edge of the sky a deep orange, and the water seemed to rush by with a different sound, clearer, brighter, as though it had just woken up from a deep sleep. Other sounds could be heard all around us. A blackbird warbling, a mallard entering the water with a clumsy splash, a heron flying silently over the stream, peering down on with its large beak like a raised dagger. We walked through the damp grass and stamped our way sideways down the bank to the first spiller. Dad waited for me, and together we studied the taut line, looking for signs of activity under the surface. Dad bent down and put his hand on the nylon. Then he straightened back up and shook his head. He pulled the line in and held up the hook for me to see. The worm was gone, probably stolen by crafty roaches. We moved up onto the next spiller, which was also empty, as was the third. Approaching the fourth one, however, we could see the line had been dragged into a stance of reeds. When Dad pulled on it, it was stuck. He muttered something, inaudible, grabbed the line with both hands and tugged a bit harder, to no avail. The current might have carried the hook and sinker into the reeds, but it might also have been that an eel had swallowed the hook and gotten itself and the line caught up in the plant stalks and was now lying there, biding its time. If you held the line taut in your hand, you could sometimes feel tiny movements, as though whatever was stuck below the surface on the other end was bracing itself.
Thank you for that. And in keeping with the mystery of the eel, we'll leave it and not say whether there was an eel at the end of that or not this time.
Yeah.
Oh, it's that a really lovely passage. Thank you so much, Patrik. One of the things that you mentioned in your book that I think maybe people in attendance today will be interested in is how quickly life changed for your family in the span of time just between from when your grandmother was a young woman to your own upbringing. And you detail in the book like specific policies and explicit action that had taken place in society and in the government that made this possible. Would you describe that for us a little bit? Like what were things like when your grandmother was a young woman, and then how did they change and why?
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's not a big part, but for me, an important part of the book. It's my family's history is. I kind of compare the travel that my parents have done with that they almost traveled like they were carried by a big ocean current, just like the small eels going over the Atlantic. But my father was born, or my grandmother was born in a very small house. Her parents were farmers, but they were the poorest kind of farmers working on a big farm, not even getting paid. There was a special system in Sweden at that time where you could work just for room and food, you know. And my father was born in the same small house, just 2 rooms where everyone was sleeping in one of the rooms, no running water and no electricity. And just 20 years later, when my father moved to his own house, he built his own house, the house I grew up in, a nice big house, and we had a car and we had a big garden and everything. And it was a truly different kind of life just 20 years later. And then some people are saying that he made he was a class traveler, but he wasn't. He was a working man all his life. He was working class, and my mother too. But you know, the class had traveled, had done this amazing journey. You know, from Sweden, of course, wasn't in the Second World War, and then we had a social democratic government for many, many years. And during this time, the conditions for most of the working class improved enormously, actually. And that was the kind of journey that my parents did, and that the whole of society did, and that I am the result of, in a way. And so this societal journey is a very important part of my own history and my family's history.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I think maybe we'll go to the next part of the reading that is about focused on the eels from page 174 to 175.
Yes, exactly. This is about the eel's journey, the eel making this incredible journey across the Atlantic, going back to the Sargasso Sea. And it's about the question that science also have struggled with a lot. It's the question of how does the eel find its way, actually. That the eel has special abilities that make it skilled at navigating great distances has long been known. It's well established, for example, that it has phenomenal sense of smell. According to the German eel expert Friedrich Wilhelm Tesch, who wrote the standard reference work, The Eel, in the 1970s, the eel's olfactory sensitivity is on par with the dog's. Put one drop of rose water in Lake Constance, Tesch claimed, and an eel can smell it. It's likely that eels use smell in some way during the journey across the Atlantic, either to locate the Sargasso Sea itself, or at least one another. It's also likely that the eel is sensitive to changes in temperature and salinity, and that these might offer clues as to which way to go. Some scientists believe the eel's well-developed magnetic sense constitutes its primary navigational tool. Much like bees and migrating birds, it can feel the Earth's magnetic field and is thus guided toward a certain destination. We know what that destination is, and somehow the eel knows it too. They know where they're going, even if the routes they choose can be both meandering and unpredictable. But how they know it is one of the mysteries still surrounding the eel question, one of the enigmas even scientists cherish. Rachel Carson, for her part, described the eel's inherited knowledge about its origin as something more than an instinct. In Under the Sea Wind, she writes about how the fully grown and sexually mature eels one autumn suddenly feel a vague longing for a warm, dark place, and how these eels, who had lived their long lives beyond all reminders of the sea, in lakes and rivers, now set off into the unfamiliar open sea, finding there something familiar, something they recognize, a sense of belonging in the large and strange rhythms of a great water, which each had known in the beginning of life. Do they remember where they came from and where they're going now? Do they remember their very first journey across the Atlantic as tiny, transparent willow leaves? No, perhaps not in a human, conscious sense, not according to our definition of memory. But when the European research team, who followed the more or less successful attempts of 700 eels to reach the Sargasso Sea, when they tried to explain how the eels find their way back to their birthplace, they still described the experience as a kind of memory. It seemed, they wrote, as though eels follow olfactory cues originating in the spawning area, or that eels navigate using oceanic cues imprinted or learned during the leptocephalus phase. Because what their study revealed more than anything was that the farther the eels got, the more they seemed to end up following a predetermined route. Simply put, they seem to follow the Gulf Stream and the North Atlantic Drift, but in the opposite direction. As though a memory, a map, had been ingrained in them when they made the journey from the Sargasso Sea to Europe as tiny, transparent willow leaves, and as though that memory had survived in the eels, remaining constant through all their metamorphoses for 10, 20, 30, or 50 years, until one day it was time to make that same journey in reverse, straight toward the mighty ocean current that had once carried them helplessly to Europe.
Thank you for that. That's beautiful. So this journey that the eel is making is getting harder to do. And there you write about how they are endangered and the kinds of threats that they face. Would you spell those out a little bit for us?
Yes, that's of course is a big part of the story of the eel, that it's now endangered, critically endangered. Scientists estimate that the number of eels have gone down with around 95% since the 70s. So in just like 40 years, 95% of all eels has disappeared. And that, of course, is the big eel question today. Why do they disappear? And that's what the science is struggling about today. And we know that there are several reasons for this. There's, of course, there's pollution that the eel is very sensitive to. There's new diseases that has been spread thanks to the human import and export of eels. The water power plants are very big problems for the eel, because they can't do their migration through them. The fishing, of course, is a problem, and also the climate change in itself is a problem, because if the temperature rises in the oceans, then the big ocean currents change. They change their speed and the power of them, which might cause troubles in migrating eels. And we know that all of these problems are affecting the eels, but what science now has tried to answer is what is the main problem, and what should we do, where to direct our efforts to save the eel. And that's where the scientific effort is today, trying to answer these last and very, very important eel questions.
Right. You make the case very powerfully how a concerted effort can be transformational, like as it was for the class of your parents in Sweden. If there is one thing that we could address that would help the eel at the moment to thrive, what would that be, do you think? I know you say the research is ongoing, but what is your sense?
I think the easy answer is maybe the water power plants, that they could easily make changes there to let the migrating eels pass without dying in these turbines. But I think we also have to address this question in a much larger form. And once again, that's where we could be inspired by Rachel Carson, that we have to change the way we actually look at nature, that we have to accept that an animal like the eel has the right to existence in itself, not because what it gives to us or what purpose it has. We have to look at the whole nature as something that we ourselves are a part of, not something we are ruling or creating or producing or trying to gain something from. That we are part of this. Part of nature, and also everything that affects nature also affects us.
Well put, absolutely. You address at some length the ideas of faith and belief, both in the religious sense, but also in a scientific sense. Would you talk about that a little bit in the book? How you address that in the book?
Well, this is a difficult question, of course. There's something in the mystery surrounding the eel that I think at least touches the mystery that is in a religious faith. I'm not a religious person myself, and I have never been, but I understand the meaning of the mystery, and I understand how we need the mystery. And when I wrote the book, from the beginning, or early in the writing process, I knew that I would want to call the book, in the Swedish title is like the Gospel of the Eel. And many people have wanted to know what I actually mean by that, calling it a gospel. But even as a non-religious person, when I myself are reading the Bible, when I read the Christian gospel, I can find things there that I can find extremely meaningful. When things about how to handle death and how to handle loss, and when Jesus says to his apostles that I will be with you to the end of times, and Paul, when he writes in a letter that death is not the end, it's just a change, something is changing. And of course, my father died from cancer. He was just 60 years old, and there was something that happened just a week or two after he passed away. I don't want to say exactly what happened because it's in the book, but something actually happened, and there was an eel involved, and this special occasion actually made me realize in a strange way that my father would be with me even when he was gone. So it was the eel actually helped me to handle his death and the loss. And in that way, this also is, of course, my gospel to the eel and to the mystery of the eel, but also to my father, and my way of trying to keep him with me in a way by writing about him.
It's so beautifully done. And as you mentioned, the book is called The Gospel of Eels, but also the Book of Eels. And they have two different covers in the British English and the American. You have them both there, don't you? Do you have the British? You have the British one too? And I have the American.
Yes, that's a American one, the Book of Eels, and in the Britain version is called the Gospel of the Eels. Yes.
But those aren't the only two, as we were talking about before the session started. This book has been widely translated, and you have some of the other language editions there too with you. Could you share some of those with us?
Yes, I have a small. That's one of the most. This is my first book, and when you write a book about eels, you of course don't expect anything special to happen. But so this whole journey with the book being translated to more than 30 countries is amazing and hard to understand. But one of the most fantastic things is when you get all these books with the different covers, different languages, different titles, and I have some of them here. This is the Swedish original.
Oh, it's beautiful.
This is the German version. We have the Portuguese edition and the Dutch edition. It's called something like The Long Way Home, I think. We have an Italian edition.
Cool.
Polish. I have the Korean version. I have the Chinese version, which I like very much myself.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, and that's some of them, and this is one of the greatest feelings about this is getting these books in your hand and seeing them, and also because, as I said before, the book is also about my father, and my father was he was a working class man. He was a kind man. He was a modest man. He was a good father, actually. There's no trauma or anything in the book, and he was the kind of man that people usually don't write books about, actually, and that's therefore it's also a great feeling that people around the world are actually reading his story. That gives me a lot of a good feeling.
Right, you brought him around the world, shared him.
Yeah.
What has the reception been like in these different countries? What are some reactions to the book that you remember or that were particularly meaningful for you?
I had a lot of great reception, and I haven't been able to travel as much this past year. So, but most of the reviews have been fantastic, and I get some great. I have gotten letters from people around the world. I don't know which one stands out, but I got a letter just a couple of weeks ago, actually, from Germany. My publishing house in Germany had gotten a letter from a bookstore in Munich. To this bookstore, there was a man, an elderly man in Munich, and he was homeless, living on the street. And he used to visit this bookstore. And when the few times he had any money, he bought a book. And just before Christmas, he had bought my book, the German edition of my book, and he read it, and he liked it. And also the book reminded him on when he was a small boy and a museum opened in his hometown. And he went there the first day it was opening, and the first thing he saw when you got into the museum was a big tank with an eel. And he was so fascinated by this that he visited this museum as a small boy every day for several months. And he got the feeling that he actually became friends with this eel. And he said this was my first friend in the animal world. And so everything, all these memories came back to him when reading the book. So he wrote a letter, a handwritten letter in German and English. And he walked into the bookstore in Munich, and he said, "Could you get this to the author?" And they said, "We can try." And they sent it to the publishing house, and the publishing house took a photo of it and sent it with email to me in Malmö, Sweden. And I got, in some strange way, got in contact with this man living on the streets in Munich, and we had something in common with him. And I wrote a letter back, and I sent it to the publishing house, and I truly hope he got it.
Oh, that is a wonderful story. Thank you for sharing it with us. That is, profound. Was there anything in the way it was received in any countries that was surprising for you? Like, oh, I didn't anticipate that, or I didn't see that angle of it.
No, not really. I can't think of any surprising reactions, but it's obvious that the good thing about writing a book about eels is it's a very international story. You know, the eel is everywhere in Europe, and there's also the American eel, and you have the Asian eel, and a lot of people around the world had a relationship with the eel. And when writing the scientific history of the eel, there's a lot of these characters. You have, I mentioned, Rachel Carson in America, and you have Aristotle in Greece, and Sigmund Freud was actually an eel researcher at one time. And in Denmark, they're fascinated by the scientists that actually found the eel birthplace, that found out that the eels are reproducing in the Sargasso Sea. And also there are parts about Japan and China in the book, so I guess the eel is a very international character in that way, and that makes it easier, I think, for people to relate to it everywhere.
Yeah, well, it's certainly been well received everywhere and made an impact globally. So congratulations for that. That's an amazing feat and so well deserved. For the English language version, did you work closely with your translator, or did you just sort of hand it over to her and let her do what she would with it?
Well, I had a contact by mail, and she when she had any questions, but the problem, as I said, this was my first book, and I wasn't really prepared for it being translated to more than 30 languages. But so what I did was I wrote a letter concerning a list of things to think about, and when I write this, it's a reference to this, and that. When you if you read the first sentence of the book, this is how the birth of the eel comes about, and that's a reference to the Gospel of Matthew. So that's one thing you should be aware of when translating it. But there's a lot of the translators that I haven't been in contact with, but the English one is called she's called Agnes Broom. I had a contact with, and she was an amazing translator, I think.
Yeah, she is. She's a great translator. We have a number of really great questions, but there was something I wanted to ask you about the translation. As a translator, I'm always really interested in what the author thinks of the book in translation. So when you read it in English, like you've done for us today, and thank you, how does it feel to you? Do you recognize the work? Does it still feel like your work? And some people find it to be transformed in some way.
Yeah, well, the good thing is that I at least understands English, so I can read a book and and have an opinion about the translation. It's harder when I come to the Chinese or a Korean edition, but I truly very much enjoys the English translation, and one thing I think she captured is I'm sorry. He captures my father. I think the language of my father.
Yeah, I think I've read it in English and in Swedish, and listened to the audiobook as well. That it's just really, really well done. I mean, obviously the original is beautiful, and the translation no less so. Really, really lovely.
Thank you.
So we have a number of questions from people who are in attendance. So I'll just go into in order. What other animals are most closely related to the eels on the evolutionary tree?
Well, not many actually, but there actually is, I think it's 16 different species of eels. So you have the European eel that I mostly write about, and then you have the American eel that are its closest relative. It looks almost exactly the same, and it's also born in the Sargasso Sea, but when they drift with the ocean current, suddenly the American eel decides to go west, and the European eel go east. So that's two different species, and that's also one of these funny questions about the eel. How do they know where to go? How do they know that they should leave the current and go west, the American eel? And then you have the Japanese eel, and you have several different other species of eels. But then you have the close relatives, like the what's it called in English? The Murana.
I don't think I know
it's
that.
It's an eel-like creature living in the ocean, and you also have the saltwater eel. That's also a different species. So.
You had said that the Japanese eel is the only one they've managed to breed in captivity. Is that correct?
Yes, exactly. That's one of the big problems when they try to if you want to have farm eels, you have an eel farm. The problem is the eel won't breed in captivity. Both the European and the American eel, they only breed in the Sargasso Sea. They won't do it in captivity. but then in Japan, where they love to eat eel, they eat like 70% of the eels in the world. The scientists actually managed to artificially breed eels in a laboratorium. They're still not very successful. The eels they have bred usually die or become deformed in many ways, but that's one thing they're working on, in both for eel for food production, but also as a way to maybe be able to save the eel.
Yeah. Yes. There are two questions here that I think you've just addressed, but they are referring to all of the eels being born in the Sargasso Sea. So here's one: the life cycle of the European eel. So interesting. I grew up in the Northeast US and not far from the Atlantic Ocean, and spent a lot of time walking in the woods, doing along small rivers and streams, particularly during the herring migration each spring. I often saw eels in the rivers there. Do these eels also come with the Sargasso Sea and follow the same sort of life cycle you described?
Exactly, and that's as I said, they are born in the same place in the Sargasso Sea. They are these small willow leaf-like larvae drifting with the ocean currents, when suddenly all the American eels just go westward and the European eels go eastward.
Right, and they're not the same. They are different. They just
that's two different species actually. You can tell them apart if you're a scientist, but it's very hard for the normal eye to tell them apart. And the scientific explanation to this is that the American eel actually grows faster and becomes bigger and stronger, and is able to leave the ocean current and go west at an earlier stage than the European eel.
Oh, yes, yes. Oh, and somebody has said that the English term I think that we were looking for earlier was the moray eel.
Yes, exactly. Thank you.
Thank you. So here's another question. The eel is said to undergo the opposite journey to that of the salmon, but each is a threatened species. Can you comment upon that?
Yes, the salmon, the eel, fishes that lives both in salt water and fresh water in different parts of their lives, as the eel does. The salmon does the same, but reversed. When they are breeding in fresh water, and then they live their adult lives in the ocean. When it's time to breed, they go back into fresh water. The difference with the salmon is that it always goes back to the same place where their parents came breeded in the freshwater. They always return to the same place. The eel, of course, is also returning to the same place to breed. It returns to the Sargasso Sea. But when the small glass eels come to Europe and swim up in freshwater, they don't go to the same place that their parents came from. It looks almost random that how they find their way to live their life in freshwater, and how they find the place to stay.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. And then in the chat, there's a series of comments, some of which we've already addressed, but one of them is, when did you decide to start researching the eel, and how did you find these elusive sources from all over Western literature?
Well, I've been, as I said, I've been fascinated by the eel for my whole life, and when my father died, and that thing happened that I talked about just after his death, I think I got unconsciously maybe the idea to someday try to write about the eel, and then when I started the research and became really deeply involved in the subject, I just read everything I could find. I've read every book I could find, all these scientific papers, and I love to do this, to really dig down deep into a subject that can seem very small and nerdy maybe, but to really dig as deep as you can into a subject. And when you do that, every new source you find leads to another source, and that's the part of the work that I think I love the most.
And it's so fun to read that whole web of things that are connected with the eels that you surface in your book. It's really fun to read. There's another comment that says your novel reminds a bit of Fredrik Sjöberg's Flugfällen. Was this an inspiration for the book?
It's not immediately an inspiration, but he's very one of Sweden's biggest like essayists, and is an inspiration also as a nature writer, and this way of writing about science and natural science, but doing it in a more literary way, using like tools and methods from literature, and using that kind of language. I think that's an inspiration, yes.
Here's another comment. As can be seen by the worldwide reception of the topic of eels, there's a lot of fascination with them. Do most societies eat eel? My dad grew up eating eel in Denmark. As the eel has become endangered, has the viewpoint of eating eel changed around the world?
It has changed a lot in Europe and in Sweden. In the southern part of Sweden, where I'm from, eel was very popular. People would always have it for Christmas, smoked eel. That is starting to disappear now because of the eel being endangered. The same thing with parts of Europe. They have had traditions on eating the glass eel, the very small glass eel, like in parts of Spain, in the Basque, but also in Italy and France and in the UK. They still eat these glass eels in the Basque, but in the UK and in Italy, it's I think disappearing. Where the biggest market today is in Asia, in Japan, where they still eat a lot of eels.
How long did you do research and write? How long did it take you to do your research and write the book?
I think I did a research for several years, reading what I could find, but the writing process was actually quite short. I wrote the book in just 6 months, and then I of course reworked some parts and had to write some new parts, but the basic part of the book was written in just 6 months.
That's wonderful. Congratulations again on it. It was fantastic. So this is one of my final questions for you is, what are you working on right now, if you're willing to share with us?
I'm writing a new book now, and I'm quite come far into it, but this is, when it comes to my writing, I'm more like the eel. I have to be somewhat mysterious. I don't really like to I like to talk about exactly what I'm writing about. I'm afraid to mention it, but I like to explore the method of writing and the way of using a more literary language, and also using like metaphors and everything when writing about science and writing about history. I like to try to evolve this side of my writing, mixing these two different ways of writing.
Well, we'll look forward to it and embrace the mystery to see what you come up with next. Thank you so much for being with us today, and thanks everybody who put questions into the chat and the Q&A. Some I didn't get to all of them as usual, but I did my best, and thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Patrik. As Stina mentioned, Meet the Authors will be on summer holidays until September, at which point we have a few surprises in store. but there's obviously still a wealth of programming to be found in the museum over the summer. One thing that caught my eye is an upcoming session with Nordic chefs called Fine Dining for All, How Chefs Fed Communities During COVID-19. And that's on May 29th. So thank you all once again for taking part in this session. Thank you particularly, Patrik. This was really wonderful. I can't wait to read your next book, and I know everyone feels the same way.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Okay. Have a lovely evening, and goodbye, everyone. We'll see you in the fall. Bye.